Taking off the mute. The Zoom is now open.
Morning. Good morning. I am not functioning at such 100%, which I'm sure most of you are not either since last Shabbos, Torah, whatever. And yeah. So today is the Matchmaker's gift, which is a nice, light story with deep enough subject to it, but the author of this book, I don't know if anybody's read her other novels. This is your third. Which one did you read? The Two Family House. The first novel was called The Two Family House. The second one, The Wartime Sisters, and this is the third one. And she tells intergenerational stories, and she has a very nice style. Have you read it? Did anybody read the book? Okay, good. At least if you read the book this time, because last time I think you all read it. Oh, good. Okay. Yeah, and often books aren't that easily available, but anyways, yeah. Oh, I'm so glad. Okay. So yeah, so it's her third book, and she's a relatively young woman. She has, I mean, I guess you could read from the book jacket that she has a degree in English and American literature, and then she has a law degree from Columbia Law School. And she practiced as a lawyer briefly. She did trust and estates law in New York City. And then she stopped because, as she said in an interview, I realized that what I really wanted to do was write. I just went to law school, which the undergraduate degree was in English literature. And then I guess she was trying to be practical because, can you make a living out of writing? And she did law for a while and really didn't like it. And so she's been lucky because her books have been published. Although she said, I listened to an interview with her yesterday, and she's very lovely to listen to. And she said, somebody once said to me when I forget who it was, a famous author said that when asked what makes a success, what kind of advice can you give to us aspiring writers, like you're a successful writer, and this writer said, just keep writing. You just write, because some of it maybe will get published and a lot of it won't, but you just have to keep writing. So she says, so when I get discouraged and when my manuscripts that I submit to my publishers don't seem to be of interest to them, then I just keep on and I try. So she's written this story. Those of you who read it know it's told with two timelines, a dual timeline, as she refers to it. And she says in an author's note at the back of the book that when she decided to write this book, writing a story, she said, I write historical fiction, like that's or whatever time period she decides to write about, it's historical fiction. But when you write a dual timeline, that means twice as much research, because if you're writing historical fiction, you have one timeline, so you research that period. If you're doing a dual timeline, although in this case, one of them, the earlier part of the story begins in 1910 on the Lower East Side in New York City, and the modern day part takes place in the mid 1990s New York, which was her own personal experience. So, and set in New York City, and the protagonist of that part of the story is a young woman who's a lawyer. And so that part didn't require too much research. So she said, okay, I don't really call it cheating, but not cheating, but she didn't need to do research on two different time periods. So she is a best-selling author, by the way. The Two Family House and The Wartime Sisters were they're not as the Jewish Book Council in their review said about her, those of you readers who like your fiction dark and complicated will find that this is not the way that she writes, because she has a charming, lighter style. Not that she doesn't talk about things, important things in life, such as matchmaking, because after all, is that not one of the most important things in life? Very definitely it is. And I found a very nice article on I forget which website this comes from, but it was about matchmaking, and it's to do with we begin reading the Torah portion of the week. So this past Sabbath, we began with the beginning, voracious. And in a couple of weeks, we're going to read the story of the first matchmaker in Jewish history. And that's the story when Abraham decides that he needs to find a wife for his son, Isaac. And so he commissions his trusted assistant, aide, Eliezer, to go and find a wife for the son. And Eliezer is known as the first matchmaker, the first shotgun in Jewish history. And so anyways, I'll read it to you afterwards. I thought it was pretty apropos to what she writes about in this story. So where does the book begin for those of you who haven't read it? The main character of the older part of the story, who continues into the 90s for a very little bit, is well, she's 10 years old, so a young girl by the name of Sara Glikman. And she comes across, we first meet her on the steamship from Europe to New York City. She's there with her family, her 18-year-old sister Hindle, and her 3 rambunctious brothers and her parents. And they're on this steamship, and that's where 10-year-old Sara makes her first match. And there's this description of how she goes on up to the top deck to come upstairs from the third class steerage where most of the Jews who came across were in, and it was not a very appealing place. And she goes on board and she sees, and her sister is very miserable, her 18-year-old sister, because she's left a young man back in the town they came from, and she's crying and crying and crying and crying, because she's so miserable at having to leave the town. And this young man who she assumed she'd marry, young little kid sister, goes upstairs, and happens to be a young man there who's very, very nearsighted, and he's cleaning his glasses. And all of a sudden, this 10-year-old little girl, Sara Glikman, sees a kind of what she describes as a strand of golden light stretching between this young man cleaning his glasses and her sister, Hindle. And something in her makes her realize that maybe, this is the one who's meant to be for my sister. 3 months later, we find out that the two of them are married, sister and this young, very nearsighted young man. That's the first match that Sara Glikman makes. And that's the beginning of her career as a matchmaker. Or the Yiddish word for that is a shotgun, someone who puts people together, who makes matches. So we're introduced in the first part. And so she says, just to read you a little bit, Sara, 1910, so you know when this piece takes place, a matchmaker for this strange new world. Sara was 10 years old when she made her first match. She had traveled for a week from Kalaresh to Libava with her parents, her sister Hindle, and 3 unruly brothers to board the giant steamship headed for New York. As the coast faded to a blurry mist, 18-year-old Hindle wailed like a colicky infant. She wept for the village she would never see again, and for the handsome young man she had left behind. Their mother, who had no patience for tears, pointed to the water that surrounded them on all sides. The ocean is full enough, she said. If you don't stop crying, you'll drown the fish. Which I'm sure in Yiddish sounds, you can imagine that that's what they were talking. Sound very good. So that's how this first match began. And 3 months later, as this first chapter continues, in New York, Hindle married Aaron, the nearsighted young man, in a one-room synagogue on Rivington Street. At the small reception held on the roof of the building, electric lights were strung on tall wooden poles, and platters of cake were set out for the guests. Sara's mother told anyone who would listen that her youngest daughter had been the one to introduce the young lovers. Can you believe it? She said to the guests. I sent her a handkerchief and she came back with a groove. A few of the guests shook their heads in disbelief, but most of them smiled or offered their congratulations. Such a good girl you have, they said. Such a blessing to her family. When all the cake had been eaten and all the schnapps had been drunk, the rabbi, a stout man in a white fur hat, took Sara's hand gently and murmured a blessing. Tell me, Rabbi Chernikov said, about the ship. Dozens of men carry handkerchiefs. What would they carry? What is him to help you? Because she had told them the story. A long moment passed before Sara answered. She chose her words like fruits at the market, weighing each one before she spoke. He was different from the other men. The others gambled on games of cards, but he stood apart. He was polishing his spectacles. Ah, said the rabbi. So he was the most prudent and scholarly of the men? Sara shook her head. Not really. He wasn't prudent, only poor. And the spectacles didn't make him more scholarly. He was cleaning the dust off of them and squinting. When I first pointed Kindle out to him, his eyes were so bad that he couldn't even see her. So you chose someone who could see beyond your sister's physical appearance. Sara hesitated. Partly, she admitted. Sara understood that though the rabbi searched for answers, he did not know enough to ask the proper question. She knew that the most important part of her encounter was not what had led her to approach Aaron in the first place, but what she had seen afterward. She did not want to lie to the rabbi, but she was not sure how to explain the phenomenon to him. Eventually, she raised herself onto her toes and whispered the story into his ear. When she described the filament of light she had seen, the rabbi did not seem surprised. Instead, his eyes sparkled with possibility. You have a calling, he said to Sara. You are young yet, but it will wait. I don't understand, she said. What do you mean? The light you saw between your sister and her husband was not a trick of the sun. You have been blessed with eyes that can see the light of soulmates reaching for each other. Whether it was the rabbi's words or the sip of brandy her father had given her or the flicker of the strange electric bulbs, Sara's head began to throb. The rabbi's voice was like the late spring rain, soft but steady and persistent. The words he spoke next fixed themselves in her mind and clung to her for the rest of her life. You are a matchmaker, Sara Glikman, a shotgunter for this strange new world. And that's the opening. That's how we meet Sara Glikman, who's 10 years old at the time, who has been told that you have a calling. And this is really the only bit of magical realism, if you want to call this filament of gold light. You know, you're thinking, is this going to be a book filled with, I don't know, Isabel Allende or Gabriel Garcia Marquez or other writers who have this magical realist style? But no, it is the only thing, is the filament of light that she describes Sara as being able, and this is what guides her when she knows that she has found someone to share. And then second chapter, you move into the more modern day part of the story. We meet Abby, who's the granddaughter of Sara in 1994. And at that point, her grandmother has just died at age 94. She was 10 when she came in 1910, and she has just died over here. And then we meet the granddaughter, and the granddaughter is the lawyer who has been very close to the grandmother and is devastated by the loss of her beloved grandmother. So those are going to be the back and forth. It's New York City, basically, just two different eras. And the first one is mainly Lower East Side, because that's where the Jews lived. The new immigrants came and lived there at that point. That was before, I'm not sure, does anyone remember when the Brooklyn Bridge was built? It was built in, I don't know, anyway, whenever I like this bit of history, just because everybody lived in down on the Lower East Side, at least people who didn't have any money. And then when the Brooklyn Bridge was built, you could cross over, and that's why people were able to move to Brooklyn. But till then, there was no bridge, and nobody lived in Brooklyn. And after that, so everybody was still down there, and I'm sure most of you have been at some point to the Lower East Side. You can go visit the Tenement Museum, or you walk the street. I think it's kind of, in the last few years, I enjoyed more of a resurgence. People still do live there, young people live there. But back in the day, it was this crowded, teeming, not very beautiful area, but that's where the Jews went. So it was a very Jewish neighborhood. The street signs were all in Yiddish. And there's a lot of Yiddish in the story. And she says that she said in the interview that she doesn't speak Yiddish. Her mother and grandmother used to, her mother and grandmother used to speak Yiddish when they didn't want her, the story, when they didn't want the kids to know what they were saying, so they keep talking another language. So she picked a lot of it up, but she said she had help in making sure that the words she used were correct and the expressions she used were correct. And so she flavors the book. She sprinkles it with Yiddish words, which to me work just fine because they add a certain flavor to the book, and you don't really look up and translate if you don't know what she's saying. But it's nothing where it detracts from the flow of the story, especially if one happens to understand most of the words she talks about. And so Sara 1910, New York City, this world of pushcart-filled streets, crowded tenements, and the beginning of a changing approach, because this is the 20th century, to traditions, as hundreds of families just like Sara's enter a new country and lifestyle. Why? In search of opportunity. And so, as a member of the Jewish faith, Sara is no stranger to the concept of matchmakers. That's how people got married. There was a shotgun. And in fact, what's the epigraph at the beginning of the book? I don't know, those of you who read it remember. It's a little quote from Hello Dolly, the lyrics of the book Hello Dolly. I have always been a woman who arranges things like luncheon parties, poker games, and love. And that's the quote from Hello Dolly. So this is a book about a woman who arranges things. So Sara, young Sara, this is how in her community people always got married. There was the shotgun, just like you think of and the author says, interestingly, people to whom the concept of the matchmaker is totally foreign have seen, almost everybody of a certain age anyway, has seen Fiddler on the Roof, right? And it's Yenta, the matchmaker, and Fiddler on the Roof. So she said, when she was doing research for this story, she said the yes to the matchmaker wasn't completely realistic because the matchmaker, really the shotgun would have been a man. And I didn't realize but shotguns were men because it was a profession back then. One made a living out of it because you have to pay for the services of a shotgun. In fact, modern day, I don't know if anybody's watching, then there was this, and the funny part is the Jewish matchmaker. I guess we were all watching, or many of us watched Indian Matchmaker, that Netflix series. No, yes, I don't know. Anyways, it was really, I watched, it was on a couple of years ago, I guess. And I found it fascinating, but in the Orthodox Jewish community, so you have J-Date is the online version, but there's still the old-fashioned idea of having a matchmaker, having a shotgun. And you are supposed to pay the shotgun. And even if the shotgun, there are professionals who charge fees, and I guess I was quite taken aback, but there are fees, $5,000, $10,000, like quite large fees, because there are people who really earn their living and work full time at this. So just like, you have to pay for J-Date, right? You have to pay for all these online matchmaking services. So, but even if you have an informal matchmaker, you are supposed to give them a gift. Because there is a thing that if you don't show your appreciation, then it's not such a good thing. Like that, I guess it's kind of superstitious, or the idea that you should really pay the matchmaker, even if they don't want to charge you and they're not professional. Give them a very nice gift to ensure that the match will be a blessed one and a lucky one. But she said, but this idea of a woman as a matchmaker, because that's what the story is based on, because young Sara is 10 years old when she makes the first match, which was her sister, and she still doesn't tell anybody except the rabbi how she came to do it. But after she slowly, and again, she's a young child, after she becomes pretty good at it, well, good, she has this gift, so it's like something is given to her and she just does it, takes advantage of this beam of light that she sees. But she starts to incur the displeasure at the beginning and then the wrath of the men who are the established matchmakers there, still in 1910, down on the Lower East Side in the Jewish community. And who is this little girl who's like, okay, again, it's fiction, we're not meant to take this, I suppose, with a grain of salt, but it's just an interesting idea of how times were changing. And Sara knows that the matchmakers where she came from, and she remembers a little bit, that they were all men. And even in this new world, the matchmakers are still men. And they are married, which is an important part of the requirement to be a matchmaker, and they are paid. So none of this applies to this young girl. And even though Sara confides in Rabbi Sheinkopf about the magic of her sister's romance, how she put it together, she keeps this gift of hers. She tells Rabbi Sheinkopf, but she doesn't tell almost no one else, especially those shadchanim, the matchmakers, who are in control. I guess they have the, what's the word, they have the monopoly on the business in her neighborhood on the Lower East Side. And then we come to her granddaughter. More than 80 years later, Sara's granddaughter, Abby, this young woman in the modern day, the mid-1990s part of the story, she has also made a career of love, albeit in a different way. She's made a career of the dissolution of love so far, right? She is a successful divorce attorney. I mean, she's young and upcoming, but seems to be on the path to success as a lawyer. She works for a rather this what's a tiger woman kind of lawyer, her boss, who is one of the city's most well-known and cutthroat star lawyers. And so Abby, as opposed to her grandmother, is aware, although no, I shouldn't say, because her grandmother was aware of the ugly side of things as well, when the matches didn't work or when people didn't behave as they should. But her granddaughter's career is as a divorce lawyer, so that's, by definition, when marriages have gone bad. That's the aspect of love that granddaughter Abby has chosen her career on. She herself, we find out, Abby's parents had divorced. She is the product of a failed marriage, and she knows that she has chosen her career specifically as a result of her father's behavior, her father's adultery and mistreatment of her mother. This is her antidote to what she perceives, what Abby perceives, young Abby, she's 26 when we meet her, to love's toxicity. And yet she adores her matchmaker, love-obsessed grandmother, Sara. When the story opens, Sara, grandmother, has been retired officially from the matchmaking business for 40 years. And yet she still delights in putting her nose into places where she feels she can be of help. Whether it means telling Abby that her college boyfriend isn't the one, predicting the fallout of the royal marriage of Prince Charles and Princess Diana, or devouring the gossip rags and deciding for once and for all that Hollywood's most fiery couples aren't done quite just yet, despite their hiring of divorce lawyers. Sara has an opinion which she shares with her granddaughter. Every bit as full of life and fire as she was when she first showed up to help raise Abby and her younger sister 14 years earlier. Because when Abby's father made the announcement one day in a restaurant where he took his wife and his two daughters out for ice cream. And after that, Abby is unable to stomach ice cream until the very end of the story, because she still associates it with that luncheon when her father announced that he was leaving her mother. She and Sara, the grandmother, comes back from Florida, back from her retirement in warm Florida, to help her daughter take care of the two girls, because her daughter is now on her own. So the two girls, Sara and her sister, have grown up with their loving grandmother as very much part of their life. So Sara, though, at age 94, is still a force to be reckoned with, which is why Abby is so shocked when her grandmother passes away peacefully one night in her sleep. This is at the beginning of the story. And Sara had always told her granddaughter, one day, my brilliant skeptic, I will be gone, and all of my stories will belong to you. But Abby has no idea just how literal this warning is until something that many authors use, or a number of authors have used, boxes of journals show up. That's a pretty, but not uncommon technique that authors use when they want a character to unravel, to find out about an ancestor's past. So in this case, boxes of her grandmother's journal are in the grandmother's apartment, and the grandmother, Sara, has wanted Abby, her granddaughter, to have them. Expecting, and what does she expect? When in her grandmother's diaries were stories of her mother's life and her love story with her grandfather, Sara's husband, Gabe. She's kind of disappointed when she first opens them, and she's seeing that the notebooks look more like catalogs. Their names and ages and professions, and temperaments of people that her grandmother knew as a girl and a young woman. So it's obvious that Abby has inherited these matchmaking journals, because these are the Shotman's, notebooks. And if you read you something in this more modern, up-to-date one, as Eliza Ben. So I don't know if anybody saw. So there was this new series. So there was Indian Matchmaker was the first series, and then Netflix put together another one called Jewish Matchmaking. And did anybody see it? It's very funny. And the woman who hosts it is a woman called Eliza Ben Shalom. Anyway, it turns out that the authors know at the back of the book that she met with her, and she got in touch with her, and she asked her opinion, the author of the book, with this Eliza Ben Shalom, who's a very well-known matchmaker. She moved to Israel a few years ago, but she comes back and forth between, and she was here. Oh, yes, right. Did anybody see her?
Yeah.
Oh, you went to see her? So she was here at
She's quite a show person.
Chabad? At Leola, yeah. Chabad brought her in, right? Yeah. Yes, she's quite a show person, which is why she was chosen to be,
600 people in the audience.
right, because I think my daughter wanted to go, and then they said, no, it was sold out, didn't get your tickets early, So, yeah.
And I saw it the other day.
Yeah.
I didn't want to be seen, but I saw it.
Well, if you wear a mask, maybe nobody would recognize you, or no, it didn't work like that, eh?
No,
Yeah.
I got it.
But I know, I've seen her interview, I looked up interviews with her, and she is definitely, which is why she was good for the Netflix show, because, I think I heard, I don't know if you would notice that the rabbi of, that on, yes.
Fair folks.
They asked the Netflix when they were looking for a host, like the MC of this show, they asked him, and he said, no, thank you, I don't think this is for me, and she got this job, so she seems to be a natural, you have to have your personality to be able to do that.
I don't know how successful she is in the
Apparently she is, from what I don't know. Anyway, but it was funny because she's mentioned in the credits in the author's note that I contacted Eliza Ben Shalom when I asked her about matchmaking. So so Sara has left these journals to her granddaughter, who looks at them, and all she sees are names and numbers and ages and professions and temperaments. And Abby doesn't understand what her grandmother wanted from her, who is this staunch skeptic, doesn't believe in love, is anti-romantic. She's seen the toxicity of her parents' marriage, and she's not going to get into the same thing until she meets someone. When a young woman, Jessica Cooper, and she's an eye doctor. And that's where she makes her first, where Abby realizes that maybe she has inherited this same gift that her grandmother has had. And it turns out, part of the story is that this young woman, Jessica, the ophthalmologist, was a product of one of Grandma Sara's early matches, where she's matched up a young medical student and a friend of her sister's. And shortly before she died, the grandmother Sara had agreed to come out of retirement to find Jessica her match, but then she passes away. And she had never been able to locate the soulmate for this Jessica, the granddaughter of one of her early matches. So it's as if she has bequeathed this task to her granddaughter. And but granddaughter Abby is really not interested in this. She has a very demanding job, a very demanding, difficult boss. And among the current things that she's working on is a prenuptial agreement between a 50-something celebrity designer and his 25-year-old model fiance. Another thing she's working on is the fourth divorce of an emotional hotelier and her poet husband. Abby is just, she says, no, she doesn't want to get involved with this, even if this is what her grandmother wanted for her. But she also starts to become very interested by her grandmother's stories. And as she continues to read through her grandmother's journals, learning love stories about the princess of New York City's Pickle King, the daughter of New York City's Pickle King, and others. And when if you look up, I know those of you who had the book and looked up, because the author's notes are always interesting. In her note, she says, for those of you who are interested, I recommend the following New York Times articles that helped to inspire me writing this book, The Matchmaker's Gift. And just as an example, here are some of the titles of these articles that she used in her research. Okay, so there are the more modern ones, but Carp Wedding Glory Dazzles East Side from June 24th, 1909. New York Times, by the way. And another article. Rates for husbands on the increase. Prices for desirables now run as high as $25,000. Can you imagine this back in? And this was an article. So the East Side Shopkins say. Article from January 16, 1910. $25,000 in 1910. Another article from 2016. Rivington Street sees war. Rival restaurant men cut prices on the succulent quiche. This is like a real headline from the New York Times. You know, so when you had this quiche war, and you thought, oh, how fanciful, very fanciful writing. Apparently it was not. I mean, I guess they were two men who had the similar kinds of restaurants, two families, and so they were competing with each other. And another headline, Jewish matchmakers form protected union in Warsaw, March 3rd, 1929. Okay, so that was back in Warsaw, but that was 1929. And there was a union formed in Poland, still in Poland, 1929, but of Shopkins. Then the articles continue. Now, an article from 1948, April 1948, a Times article. The headline was 600 an outdoor wedding. Rabbi and bride met in U.S. after fleeing from Poland. Another article, 1949, and there were several articles, post-war articles, about couples who met after the war and how Shopkins helped them meet. So she really did a lot of research, and the stuff, the beam of light, as I said, is the magical wheel, is part of the story, but the rest of it seems to have, research. She has researched her book. So this, the Pickle King and the Knish War there, her stories about her own grandfather, and she starts to find, this is Abby, our 26-year-old young woman, skeptic about love and matchmaking for sure. She starts to find surprising parallels to her own life as a single woman on the Upper West Side and her cases, her work cases, her divorce cases, and the people she meets, the couples she meets as she's working on these cases. And in a shocking moment of clarity, I guess a pun, she spots the same glistening light that sealed her grandmother's first match. The only problem with this beam of light that she sees is that it suggests the connection between a young man that she's kind of dating, really likes, doesn't quite feel he's the one for her, but he's a really nice guy. Except, who is it with? Where does the beam of light go? Not to her, to one of her boss's most demanding clients, that 25-year-old young woman who's engaged to the 50-something-year-old celebrity designer. And so this for Abby, this is no, this doesn't, even though, she's doubting that she ever really saw this, but if she really did see this, this is not a match that is supposed to go. And she's nowhere near ready to accept that she has inherited her grandmother's gift. But she's even less prepared to accept the most beautiful, expensive gift of all, which is her own love story. And unfortunately for her, she is going to need both to serve her most difficult clients, it turns out, as well as to forge her own path in life and eventually love. So the book has a nice happy ending, or at least a very hopeful ending. And the author shows that again and again, well, it's her third novel, she is a very skilled craftsperson when it comes to putting together immersive and well-researched historical settings and populating them with multifaceted characters. Again, this is writing, as I said, it's easy to read, even if the topics are, the subject that she writes about are important, serious subjects, there's nothing that, there's a lightness to her writing. And in this book, she did something that she did not do in her other books, which was that she added this element of magic. And the book is not a fantasy by any means, but it does it has this little bit of magic that is matched very well with her characters. And these characters do battles with feminism, religion, ambition, and power in her novel. I mean, that's what gives it more emotional heft than it otherwise might have had. So it's, you could say, a warm and uplifting and charming story that will leave you, feeling good. So that's the basic outline of the story. One of the things I wanted to talk about was where Abby rediscovers that her grandmother had come back to her matchmaking vocation. So what happens in the story too? So the chapters go back and forth, and the 1994 chapter where Abby is working on these cases and she has to figure out among her couples who are getting divorced, should they really be getting divorced? And it turns out that she feels that they shouldn't, but what kind of a lawyer is she? Is she going against her boss's wishes? She gets herself fired at the end of the story because she goes against her boss's wishes. Her boss is runs a divorce law firm. She doesn't want her employee, this young upstart, going and not getting the couple's divorce, not writing. I mean, she's supposed to be drafting prenuptial agreements, or she's supposed to be drafting divorce agreements, not making the couple stay together or rematching them with other people. But of course, this is fiction, and Abby is doing that, and she's the granddaughter of her grandmother, the matchmaker. But in the Sara part, and of course, I think maybe, I don't know what you think, but by definition, usually the period when you have these dual timeline stories, if well done and if authentically portrayed and well researched, the older setting is often the more interesting one because it tells us about a different time and place than modern day, even though 1994 is by almost 30 years now, it's still not ancient history. Like we all remember this, us at a certain age. And so it's really interesting to read. And this whole idea of these men who got so upset, again, I don't think that this is fiction, that there was this young girl who was taking away their clients and making matches and not charging anything. And they take her to a Jewish court of law, to a Din, and she has to stand there. And it's at that court of law, that Din, where she, Sara, meets her own future husband, a young lawyer who works for a legal aid clinic, which and grandma, this is how grandmother meets hers. And what happens? I mean, you'll read the story, but it's cute the way she realizes that, how she herself realizes in the book who her Bashert is supposed to be, like what gives it away. It's not so much a beam of light, but it's something else that her grandmother or that she was told. So but then when does Abby find out that her grandmother came back to her matchmaking vocation? It was in the post-war years of the 1940s, when rabbis, and so what happens? Grandma Sara has to fight, she has to go and appear in front of the Din, which is three rabbis ruling, and this group of angry men, shatanim, matchmakers, who claim that this upstart of a young woman has no business ruling their business. And who is she? And tradition says, she's single, she's a female, like this is not right. And she wins her case in court, and she goes on in her way to do what she does. And then she does it, and then she retires. And then again in the 1940s, she comes out of retirement because there's a new need. and it's Holocaust survivors. And it's not developed much in the story, you know, if it would have been a different book, because the book is meant here to look at the two characters of Sara and Abby. But that's a very interesting idea of and as we all know, you know, the matches that were made among survivors after the Second World War and how those stories came to be and how many people, and that's really a tribute to the resilience of the human spirit. I mean, how many marriages took place in the BP camps in Germany after, you know, when the Bergen-Belsen babies were born after the war. Like, it's really remarkable. And so there was this whole thing, and that's why she has these articles, New York Times articles in 1946 and 1948 about couples who met. So in her fiction, Lynda Loigman has Sara, the matchmaker character, making matches between these survivors, and the rabbis of the community come to her and say, use your gift, whatever gift you have, because she doesn't share with them this beam of light idea, because that sounds too ridiculous, but just whatever you have this talent to make matches, please use them for these Holocaust survivors in order to continue the Jewish race after the Holocaust, the Jewish people in America after the Holocaust. So there are things there that, and then as well, we also find out that Sara, as her granddaughter Abby works on divorces at the beginning, that's what she's doing, which is the failed side of matchmaking and love, her grandmother also has an ability, just as she can see who's meant to go with who, she can also sense when something is wrong, when they are not supposed to be together, and she can advise against matches that other people might think are excellent ones, and she has a feeling no. And she also senses when things are not going well. And there's a small example of in her later years when this young woman who she sees coming with some bruises, and she asks her what's going on, and oh, nothing, I just fell, you know, it's like, oh, your eye is black, yeah, I banged into something. And she's able to use her gift, her matchmaker's gift, in order to help women in abusive relationships as well. So there's some not really developed much, because that's not the point of the book, but there's some stuff like that as well. But the magical realism, as I said, is really pretty well limited to this theme of life. And the book ends, said with I'll tell you the details, those of you who haven't read it, but it's a nice ending, uplifting and hopeful, and you are left with at the end of the and there's a nice part I wanted to share with you. In the middle of the book, it's 1918, and it's in the Sara section of the book, and it's the one time, or the first time, that young Sara, so how old would she be? She was 18 at the time, in 1918. She questions her calling there at the very beginning. Don't forget, she's only 18 years old. For the first time since her sister had gotten married, Sara Glikman questioned her calling. It wasn't that she doubted her abilities. She was as certain as ever of her gift. It was just that the heartbreak of having to give up Nathan, that was the young man who she thought she was destined to be with, who she got the sign that no, when she sees this theme of life going from who she thought was her intended to another woman. And she wondered if this was part of the reason that her father had wanted her to get married before making matches. And this is an interesting thing, because traditionally, as she says in the book, and it used to be traditional, that matchmakers have to be married themselves. That was so, and her father had said to Sara, you should be married yourself. Why? Was he predicting the melancholy that might come on his daughter if there would be things that she would see or be involved with that it would make her unhappy? Had he foreseen that her special abilities might force her to lie to someone that she really felt for? And so she decides again to pay a visit to Rabbi Shenkov. She was the man back in the first time when she confides, when he asks her, make that match between your sister, you know, the 10-year-old, and she confides in him that she sees this theme of life. And she goes to him and she says, what's the problem? And she says, and she explains to him what happens. And he said, like, why? I thought you were, and she said, well, I saw something, Rabbi. And he says, your gift again. And she says, yeah, but some days it is no gift at all. Sometimes it feels more like a curse. And the rabbi says to her, my dear, you bear a heavy burden. One only you can know the weight of. The only way for you to ease it is to share your suffering with someone else. Perhaps this is why you have come to see me. And he waits. And she doesn't know, she feels embarrassed, she doesn't know what to say. And then she explains to him that she saw that this Nathan, who she thought was for her, she saw her sign that it was for somebody else. And she even knows who it was. And was this the real curse of the matchmaker? That to know that people who were so in love were unlikely to listen to almost anyone who professed to have superior knowledge. Like, did that mean that, when you were so smitten that anybody could tell you things and you're not thinking straight? Was this why the Shadchanim had insisted that anyone making matches must be married? Maybe there was something to that. Did they believe that the temptation to use their influence for personal romantic gain could be too great? Sara knew that being married was not a guarantee of good or honest behavior, because many of the Shadchanim, maybe they didn't lie outright, but they were prone to exaggeration and half-truths and artful manipulation. Like, is she good looking? The Shadchan might be asked. Oh, she has lovely brown hair. Is she, you could say saying the best of people, but so Sara was not like these men. At best, their pairings were based on a mix of good intentions, careful research, and a little bit of luck. At worst, they were based on money alone. Regardless, the goal was always marriage, and marriage was not the same as love. What the Shadchanim could never understand was that for Sara, a match was not something to be made. Either love existed or it did not. What Sara saw, she saw. What she knew, she knew. Her method was as pure and unpredictable as the first purple crocus to emerge in this spring. Okay, so she agrees. Yes, the rabbi was right. Maybe her gift could be a burden, but she couldn't shirk her obligation. And the rabbi said, yeah, and she said, but how am I ever going to be able to find someone for myself if I'm always worried about what I'm going to see in his future? What if, one day, I marry him and then I see this beam of light going to some other woman? Like, this is not good for me. So Rabbi Chenkov blinked his eyes. He's the wise rabbi she goes to see. He says, I don't think so. I think that you learned something very valuable in this process. He said, Sara, when we met you, you were 10 years old. You were a young girl blessed with the rarest of talents, a gift most of the world could never imagine. Despite your youth, you understood its significance. And yet, we mumbled, and yet what? And yet, my dear, you were still a child, a brilliant child, but a child nonetheless. Of course, a child is no stranger to love. She loves her parents, she loves her family, she loves her teachers or her friends, but you don't know the kind of romantic life. But your gift led you to believe that love was always free of pain, always joyful and uncomplicated. It taught you that love comes in a flash of light, that it is always remarkable and instantaneous. But in all of this, I'm afraid you were very much mistaken. And then he tells her something very helpful that she's going to remember, this young Sara. He says to her, you know that my wife died a long time ago, years before I came to this country. But I never told you how we met or how she came to be my bride. We had barely spoken before we were married, and our first months together were far from happy. Of course, it was a different time. That's the way things were done. But it was almost 2 years after our wedding that Rivka told me that she loved me for the first time. Remember Fiddler on the Roof? It kind of makes this sign. Do you love me? Do I love you? Do you love me? Do I love you? Yeah, that's always good. Anyway, so he says here, this young Sara, 18-year-old Sara says, what happened? And the rabbi says to her, Her brother was forced to kill a cow, and he brought us a piece of meat for our dinner, which was an enormous luxury. Rivka, my young bride, had no idea how to cook it. We never had a piece of meat. We were very poor. And he stops to smile. He stopped to smile at the memory. Our little home was filled with so much smoke that we were forced to eat our meal outside because she didn't know how to cook this and it was burnt. She left the charred meat on her plate, but I ate my whole portion and I told her it was delicious. That night, she kissed my cheek and she told me how much she had grown to love me. He brushed away the tear that had fallen onto his cheek. On the day that my Rivka died, I knew for certain that I would never love another woman again. Sara considered the rabbi's words. I wish I had been at your wedding. I wonder what I would have seen. The rabbi shrugged. Who can say? Love is not always a straight, shining light. Sometimes love is a shady path full of unpredictable turns. And so that was a very nice bit as she talks about how this gift, also, the matchmaker's gift, at times could have also been, as she says, the matchmaker's curse. But she perseveres, and so the story goes on. I found this, I was going to say to you, I found this article on matchmaking. So that's the book, and it's filled with, and the author said she wrote it. Those of you who read the book and read the author's note, well, sorry if I repeat. She said that in March of 2020, when the pandemic began, her college-age daughter and her roommate it was March 2020, remember March 2020, when the whole world closed down. So her daughter and roommate came to live, the author lives in a place called Chappaqua, which is north and Westchester, north of New York City. So her college-age daughter and roommate came home and lived with them. And the author said it was really nice because until then it had been my son who was a senior in college, and my husband and my dog, and now I have these two young women, these two intelligent, curious, and very fun young women. Okay, the circumstances were unusual, but at least they had the two of them. It wasn't just one, so they did their college classes online when that started to get organized. And we spent the whole spring together navigating our strange new normal. Her husband is a lawyer, she says. My husband learned how to take depositions over Zoom. My son had a virtual high school graduation. We baked a lot and took the dog for long walks. And I was working on a novel, but it wasn't coming together the way I had. That summer, my daughter's roommate, Adele, told me about her grandmother who had once been a matchmaker, an Orthodox Jewish matchmaker, a chaplain. Her grandmother had been such a success that, in fact, in 1977, the New York Times ran an article about her, this daughter's roommate who was living there for that whole spring. The article stuck with me and eventually inspired me to think of a matchmaker story of my own. So that's how this book came about. She was working on a completely different book, and then she heard about this idea. And she said, I discussed the idea with my agent, who spoke to my editor, and they were very enthusiastic. They encouraged me that I have to put aside the novel I had been working on and focus on this new idea. She said, after reading about an article called Love on the Lower East Side, I decided to anchor my fictitious matchmaker in that same neighborhood during the 1910s and 20s. Although the pandemic made it not possible for me to travel to the Lower East Side at the time, I was aided in my research by online collections of the Tenement Museum, the Center for Jewish History, the New York Public Library, and of course the museum at Elmwood School. But it was from these sources, as well as others, that I learned about the wedding of the pickle millionaire, the real Knish War of 1916, and the formation of matchmaker unions. In my novel, I reimagined these events and altered them to best suit my story. And she goes on to say this. So this is what brought her, and she goes on to describe some more of the research that she gives these articles. And she actually, I didn't look this one up, but I think I'm going to after this, Finding a Find, Catching a Catch for Brooklyn's Orthodox Jews, that January 1977. So that must have been the article her roommate's, her daughter's roommate grandmother, who was the shotgun there in Brooklyn. So it's easy to read. It's a lovely book. It's just the kind of story that when you shouldn't be looking at the news, I guess, about what is going on, read this if you would like something a little bit, uplifting and cheering. So this article that I found on matchmaking, I was looking up articles to see about matchmaking. So it was a commentary on the Torah portion when Abraham sends his loyal servant and assistant Eliezer to go find a matchmaker. And so this rabbi who's writing the article says, what decision can we make that is more faithful than the choice of a lifetime mate? From that decision unfurls, or can unfurl, years of happiness, successful child rearing, the blessing of a home filled with learning, respect, and holiness, or not. Finding the right mate can be fraught with uncertainty, a decision of remarkable moment, so important, so weighty, so meaningful, the decision, that sometimes it is a wonder that any of us manage to do so. Our tradition is very clear when it comes to marriage. It's not supposed to be a transactional perspective, let's say, like the English gentry who married, for political reasons or matching of wealth and stature. It's not supposed to be simply a wedding of family and assets. It's considered something very, very holy and very, very important. And we do hold that each of us has a true soulmate with whom we are supposed to share our lives. That's the expression bashar, someone who is meant for you. However, the task of recognizing who that special person is and engaging in the act of bravery necessary to make the connection is not for the weak of heart, writes this rabbi. I mean, this was before the book was written. He's just writing about the Torah portion of the week. Our perfect match might cross our path 100 times a day, or she might be happening to visit family and crosses our path but once. We might share a plane, a railway car. We might not look up from reading something at the right moment to find ourselves looking into the eyes of the one that God has chosen for us as our beloved and miss it. Or they might be right there in front of us and we do not see. There are so many opportunities to miss the moment when we realize our perfect match. So he says, so our tradition has said the risk of not finding the perfect match is too great to lead to chance encounters. The great personal relationship drama of our lives is too essential to trust even our own transitory passions, the sudden lightness in our hearts, or our own fleeting hopes and dreams. So in our tradition, as Abraham turned to his trusted servant to find a match for Isaac, we turn to the matchmaker, the shotgun, to ensure our perfect match. And in this age of J-Date and I don't know, all kinds of dating apps and J-swipes and bar scenes, it seems that finding a match is not easy, hasn't made it any easier. But do we really believe that finding the life mate that God intends for us is any more or less difficult now than in the past? Imagine how difficult it must have been from Abraham, who's trying to find a soulmate for his one beloved son. He lives very far from his family, and he's trying to find the match for his son who could perpetuate the values and the ideals that Abraham has. So then he sends Eliezer, but I don't know if you remember the story. So but Eliezer, the trusted servant, says to his master, I have a daughter. What about me? What about, why do you have to go send me off to your family? My daughter, she's not good enough for you. And that's an interesting part of that Torah portion. And it's not, because that's not, and Abraham says, no, please go like I have instructed you. And that's where he meets Rivka, that's where he meets Rebecca. And that's the first shot in the story. So this rabbi continues in this article and says that the need for wise and insightful matchmakers has not lessened in our modern age, or we shouldn't believe that the potential for deviousness and trickery among the shakanim has lessened either. We would be very foolish to think that the pitfalls of finding an honest marriage broker have lessened since back in the days when Eliezer tried to suggest his own daughter to Abraham. And this rabbi writes, he says, when I shared with my colleagues that I wanted to write an article about matchmakers, about shakanim, I was given a great deal of advice, most of it directed to the point. Be careful, tread lightly, as colleague after colleague shared horror stories of matches gone wrong. And so he says, How can we highlight what goes right when this very difficult task is engaged? He says, you look up on the internet, different sites suggest many ways to be a good matchmaker in all kinds of articles. And then he says, I remember a woman who is a matchmaker, because I remember from when I lived in Pittsburgh many years ago, and she's been a matchmaker for a while. And she said to him that she has 5 points to being a good shot. The 5 P's, she says: be patient, positive, persistent, persuasive, and pragmatic. And what's her bit of advice here? So I didn't bring a matchmaker, but I'll share some advice with you instead. So she says, this is from a long time shot there. She tells the rabbi writing this article. Every time you meet somebody who is not married and you are impressed with, you feel that they're a mensch, try and think of somebody you can set them up with. Write down their name and their contact information. 2, keep a list of everyone that you know is single and add to it as you meet new people. Make 2 lists, one of the men and one of the women, and write down what you liked about them. Be proactive on behalf of your single friends. Be persistent. Always follow through with an idea. Put thought into your match ideas. Be respectful of the decisions that singles make and do not second guess them or give them unsolicited advice. So this is very good advice from this matchmaker. Do not push them into dating someone that they do not want to go out, and do not ever make them feel that if they don't go out with this person, they will never marry. Value their judgments. Be discreet, guard the privacy of the singles you are helping, and do not repeat the details of their dates to anyone else. Don't think that you have to be a proven matchmaker in order to set people up. Anyone can set up a match as long as you persevere and use some common sense and compassion, which he instructs him to. So there you go, some tips on. We should all try and be matchmakers, and we should all be privileged to make some matches. And I heard something from, I know it's that if you make, this is true again, where I heard this, that someone who's made 3 matches, okay, I don't know if it applies to professionals, I guess that's a lot more. If you made 3 matches, then your place in heaven is guaranteed. So that's something to think about. And something to, I guess, anyway, thank you very much. And we wish you a good day, a good month, and we hear good news soon. Yeah, all of that.